Hi, everyone. I'm Todd Keats, founder of One Day, One Week, which is a blog for caregivers and patient advocates. And you can follow at www.onedayOneweek.com. And what we've now launched is a podcast series called Caregiving Insights. And my guest today, I'm really excited to have on board. It's a departure from some of the more serious topics that I've been covering. And Steve Ziegler, who's Director of Philanthropy at Mercy Neighborhood Ministries in Philadelphia, is my guest. Before I get into a little bit more about Steve, I'll share with you how Steve and I met. It's kind of funny, which is funny today because the topic is humor. But Steve and I met at the Philadelphia Public Library in an elevator. We were at an event and we just started chatting, and this is when I was leading a company called Stock for Good, which was automating stock donation process to nonprofits. And we just started chatting and we had a great conversation, and one thing led to the next, and Mercy became one of Stock for Good's partners, beta partners, and we just stayed in touch. And in part of that was Steve's background, and I'm going to touch on that in a minute because that's going to be the lead into our topic today. So Steve's a Philadelphia guy and graduated, has both his bachelor's and his master's from LaSalle University. And one of the things that I understand about Steve is that he's an ardent believer in systems theory, and we might wonder, what is systems theory? So it's that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And that could mean the parts, cannot help but make the whole stronger. And that applies to so many things. It could be school systems, sports teams, governments, touring musicians, and even comedy shows. And that's the segue into today's episode, because humor is the topic for today, and it's a great one for caregiving and patient advocates. And so you might be asking why, and that's because from 2014 through 2019, Steve ran a side gig where he had founded. And what it did was he curated and managed talent, especially stand-up comedy. So he independently produced and oversaw all aspects of the process, from booking the venues to hiring the talent to everything. And so you wonder, well, what's the tie-in with caregiving? And well, we're going to get into that. So I'm going to turn it over to Steve, and we're going to go back and forth. And the first thing I'm going to ask him is, tell us a bit about why you decided to produce comedy shows.
Sure. And Todd, thank you for having me. I just want to say, I'm glad systems theory is the one thing I remembered from grad school, because it worked out for interpersonal communication, but I really do believe in systems theory. So I'm glad that one stuck. Just funny to think about sometimes. Why I started comedy is actually, it started kind of as it was a little self-serving in the beginning. I had self-published a series of essays that I worked on, and my friend Matt Durkin, who ended up becoming the co-founder of our business, he was pursuing a career in stand-up comedy, and we decided to have a variety show. And it started with a small room on a Wednesday night off South Street. My thing was, I was there to do my reading of my essays, and it wasn't full stand-up. It was music. It was Matt doing stand-up. It was me telling stories. It's very biographical. I don't know how much I had really accomplished at 27 to be doing essays, but it was a fun night. And we came up with the name Starving Artist Prevention, because what we learned, just as a quick foray into that world, is that a lot of people, the amateur level particularly, weren't paid. And I was like, you know what? There's an easy way to do this and elevate people who are just starting out and put some money in their pockets realistically. I could go on about that. That's how it started. But that was in 2014, but we really didn't start rolling until 2015. We did one show in the summer of 2014, Matt was trying to start a venue at an ice cream shop, reopening like a gelato shop, coffee shop, whatever it was in Norristown. He did a show of his own there. So those are the only two things we did in 2014. 15, we went back to the same venue and then got access to a theater that was reopening in Norristown and rolled with that for a while as like our home base. And it spawned a lot of different things. It let me see different facets of the business. It was a lot of fun, but that's kind of where it began.
That's awesome. Are there one or two performers that just stand out in your memory as, wow, these guys are great? And did they ever amount to anything more than local?
Sure. Yeah, there's a few. There's one man I have to say that would have accomplished the most and would have accomplished more before he passed away was this comic Chris Cotton. And he was a Philadelphia guy as well. He made it to Comedy Central. He was like on the cusp of his big break and unfortunately had a rare heart condition and passed away at the age of 32. And I was managing him, and I wish I had gotten to know him better at that point, because he killed at every show that I booked him on. Also, a friend of mine, Brian Isley, is currently still performing with the dream to open up his own club. But we recently reconnected again, and I think might be bringing some of this comedy stuff back. But he was someone that I worked very closely with. And a friend of mine actually from childhood who's really starting to kind of blow up on the Philly scene and around is a guy named Steve Rinaldi. He does this YouTube series called South Philly Spots, which is very cool, little businesses and things like that. I mean, he's funny nonetheless. He opens for people like Dom Herrera and bigger names like that in Atlantic City now. So it's been fun to watch that progression of people that I've known for a long time. But those are three names that really stick out to me of people that I've worked with very closely. And one more person, her name is Chanel Ali. I only booked her on one show and we hung out maybe twice. And she's going to be a household name in a few years. She's got a short special on Comedy Central now, but Chanel's wonderful. And she's in New York and does a lot of work in LA now, but I'm proud to have had her on a show as well.
That's awesome. That's great. So how does it feel for you when you put these shows on and you never know what's going to happen, just like any performer? How does it feel when you have an incredible show?
It's great. The feeling of putting on a great show to me, it's based on the reaction of the crowd, because I've put on bad shows too. And I've had one maybe in the lineup that should have been up front in the show and closed out the show. You always want people leaving on a high note. When I can tell people are leaving on a high note, it's exciting. It's a lot of chatter in the lobby or whatever it may be. People are in an elevated mood on their way out. And there was more of that than not. That's what makes me feel good. As long as I know people had a good time, I'm all for that. And on the other side of it, performing, I've really only experienced a handful of times, but that's an even more I don't even know, like such a positive sensation is the only way I can really describe it. Is like you feel elated almost if you can make a room full of people laugh. And one time I did that at a bar on like a Wednesday night at an open mic, and I was just out there to get to know people, and it was my first time performing there, first time meeting a lot of people. That feeling is something I wish I could capture. I think that takes a lot more work than promoting shows, but nonetheless, it's all about the reaction of the crowd and knowing that they came out, they took time out of their evening to come see your show. They got a babysitter, they did whatever, they did what they had to do. So everyone needs to perform, the people on stage and the people behind the scenes. If you're not putting on a great show, you're not going to have a repeat customer in that way.
Absolutely. So why do people connect with humor? What's your take on that?
I have a few thoughts on that. Like my one initial thought is like it's an escape, but it also helps us point out the absurdities of life and like what we're escaping from. I think it's funny to say there's like a seriousness to comedy, because a lot of what is being addressed or what is being discussed are things that may bother us, may make us uncomfortable. But if we can point out, if we can laugh at it, it helps you find out that like everything is not that serious. Like I would joke with people before, I'm like, people perceive me as like a serious person because I can be quiet until I get to know people, then I'm certainly not. And then, but if I'm perceived as serious and promoting comedy shows, there's like a contradiction there. But I think I like that. I like that aspect of it. I think people gravitate to it for that reason, to be able to shake off the seriousness of day-to-day life. And yeah, there are going to be things that maybe offend people. But the great thing about comedy, or that other people don't find funny, but the thing about comedy is that, like with music, there's so many different genres, there's a lot of variety out there, and it's so many different voices. I think you can hear a different perspective that agrees with some of your own feelings, and you can also learn something from people as well. I think comedy resonates on so many levels. But going off of that, the hard thing of being a comic is conversations that I've had with people, some like the top people in Philadelphia who would perform at some of my shows, and we would get a good crowd, but they'd say, if I was playing music, this place would be filled. So stand-up is an acquired taste. People, I think everyone likes to laugh, but some people prefer sitcoms, some people prefer going to a stand-up show. It all depends on their own personal taste.
Absolutely. It's interesting because there are a few points that we're going to be segueing obviously into how this affects caregivers, patient advocates, patients, families, how it all is helpful. But there were a couple of notes I put down here. So what you had mentioned, it speaks to their lives. So you think of all the comics out there and what they're talking about, as you said, the absurdities of life at times, but just real life situations. It can be hard at times for people to laugh and laugh at themselves. So this is sometimes, maybe I would think the comedian is saying something that they're afraid to express, and they're hearing it like, yeah, that's me. I want to say that, but I identify with that. I just can't say it. So there's that connection there, and it helps alleviate stress in lives. I mean, let's face it, humor, comedy helps alleviate stress, and that's going to be a big part of what we're going to be talking about today. And that's why people go to those shows, whether it's conscious or unconscious. When we talk about it speaking to their lives, it's speaking to both the fears and the joys of life. So you can laugh at something that is, we're fearful of something, we can't express it. And that's why I think similarly musicians speak for people. They hear the lyrics, they hear the words, and they identify. Comedy, similarly, they hear the jokes, they hear that, and they can identify. Would you say that's pretty true?
I think that's totally true. And it had me thinking about the music part and the variety, or people saying that they can't say that. Yeah, there's of course like this free thought, free speech aspect to, I think, all art, freedom of expression. There needs to be a balance to it. Like yes, there are comedians that exist that just tend to, or have in the past, like shout their punchlines, and it's not that funny. And like, at least to me, that's not that funny. But someone who's maybe a little more understated wouldn't be funny to someone else. There's also things like, I would talk to people and be like, your punchline like shouldn't be a curse. That's not going to resonate with people. Like time and place, or overusing, like overusing foul language as an example, which is not something that bothers me, but it takes away from what you're crafting, your intelligence perhaps, or what the audience perceives as intelligent. if you're not able to weave that together. And in a way, the point I was trying to connect, I hope I can do this, is like music. It's a cadence to your voice. It's the way you deliver things. It's the same way there's a flow and a rhythm to music. There's a flow and a rhythm to comedy. And that's why it takes so long to truly perfect it, because you can say something that someone totally doesn't agree with and still make them laugh, because it's like, you're not up there as if you're making a a staunch political statement or whatever it may be. It'd be like, oh, I don't share that opinion, but that is a funny way to look at it, and in general. But yeah, I agree with you there, that it taps into people's feelings and the way they want to express themselves. They can see that it's coming through a certain art form.
Before we segue into the caregiver patient advocate part, I'm going to throw something in here. When you think of the greatest comedian, and it's hard to do. I mean, there's so many great comedians out there, comedian. But I'm gonna shape it a little bit. One that did not use any foul language, one that was supremely intelligent and connected with the absurdities of life, and conveyed it in a way that just was spot on. Is there one that comes to mind? I have one, so I want to know if we're going to the same place.
With that description, like Seinfeld comes to mind right away. Trying to think of the other big guy, like the big names, but I mean, Seinfeld, if you look at that, it's everyday humor. It could still be like edgy, or like even what Larry David does now on Curb Your Enthusiasm, kind of just pushes the Seinfeld envelope a little further because he can do that now. But who are you thinking of?
George Carlin.
Okay.
He was so brilliant in how he just took the absurdities of life and looked at them, and his delivery was excellent in the way that he did it. But over here and over here, and he just, right. It was just, I thought it was masterful.
Well, I think Carlin and Richard Pryor are I think it's probably inarguably the greatest two of all time. You called me on the foul language thing, because George wasn't clean, but he is probably, yeah, he's up there as like my favorite, I think, that I can sit and listen to. But sometimes I'll say, like, Richard Pryor, if you watch Live on the Sunset Strip, I've never seen anyone do stand-up comedy for 2 hours straight and continuously kill outside of that special. So he may surpass and be number one in my eyes from that view. But you talk with anyone, they're usually going to say those two. You're right. Yeah, George Carlin immediately as one of the best, if not the best.
I guess my image of Carlin must have been TV special, so there was no cursing. The Night Show or something like that.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, he may have hosted for a while. We're going to deviate if we start talking about all that stuff, but
yeah. True. Let's switch over, or segue over, to the caregivers and patient advocates. So you and I both know what that entails. I mean, you see it in your work. You see how people are caring for older folks and of all ages. So the caregiving, and you know what the intensity can be depending upon what the illness is, and people helping with the ADLs, the activities of daily living, which feeding and bathing and just so much. It's intense. I mean, it really is. And then patient advocates, it can often be the same person, it could be separate, where the patient advocates are constantly having to make sure they're on top of everything with the healthcare system. There's always mistakes being made, and you've got to stay on top. And not that they're intentional mistakes, but just by nature of how the system's set up, and it's overwhelmed and it's taxed to the max. So you have to make sure you're asking questions, knowing the patient bill of rights, what your rights are, and so forth and so forth. So it's a serious role. So there's a juxtaposition of this serious role, but where does the humor come in, and how do you do that? Because it's so important to do that. And I'm as guilty as any. When I first rolled into this role with my mom in June of 2018, and have since with her and my dad, it's sometimes really tough to laugh, depending upon to what level. So, because you're taking this role so seriously. So I guess when we look at why people connect with humor, and it's something as simple and natural as humor that can have health benefits. And so what are your thoughts about that? And have you seen that in your work?
Yeah, I see this a lot. And I'll speak quickly from a fundraising perspective, since that's my role. The hardest thing I think sometimes to hear is that the senior population, older adults that we work with, is not a quote unquote sexy program that people want to fund. What I see here at Mercy is, we're serving a community that is generally underserved. That's our role. That's our mission. But we're also helping caregivers have a safe place where their loved one can come and receive care that they trust in every day. And it is a big part of it is activities of daily living. It's exercise. It's having 2 meals a day while they're here with us, ensuring that they have their medication. And that's even one thing. Like, we're a nonprofit, we're not a health organization. So unless we have a nurse on staff that day, even a volunteer nurse, we can't administer medication. So that's a tough thing. When it comes to humor and kind of keeping it light, I would say there's no group here that probably laughs more than our CNAs. And I can understand why. Like, they need to take a break from that room, and like, they have to breathe a little bit. They're doing probably the most serious work in our organization. And we have a great team here. You mentioned dealing with the state or dealing with the system and how it's set up. We have on our finance in our finance office, we have, I would call her an advocate too, Miss Betty, who's communicates between the caregiver families, the program staff, and the state when it comes to billing and all that kind of stuff. On a very negative note, when it comes to reimbursement for folks who need it, who are receiving Medicare, Medicaid benefits. I've been in this job for 7 years, and in 7 years, the reimbursement has not increased from the state of Pennsylvania for what we receive. Our costs certainly have for what it costs to run this program. But most people, I believe it's something like 85% in this program qualify for subsidies. So they need that reimbursement to come to this program, even if it's for 3 days a week. Very rarely do we have people that are here for 5.
Whether it's programs at Mercy or it's an individual caregiver, there's so much crossover, aside from the programs and the reimbursement aspects, but just in terms of the responsibilities, and then how does laughter work in? I mean, let's face it, laughter it's a stress buster. For anybody, anywhere, but it's especially the CNAs there and individual caregivers who are helping anywhere in this neighborhood. Somebody, for me, it's helpful, and it's hard at times. It's really hard to try and just pull yourself out of these situations. And how do you find the humor in certain moments? It's not always easy, but the key is to try to embrace those moments. I mean, and to try and have both people, so the cared for and the caregiver. If you can both do that, you are then taking big steps forward, not just in that moment, but in that relationship.
Sure. And that's very important. I wish I knew the families better that trust us with their parents or older relative. But we are also, it's interesting to think about that the people that we're serving are over the age of 60, but that could be 60 to 100. And some of their children are also eligible for this program. So it's like, it's an aging community. And it makes me wonder about like how we're going to take care of them in the future.
That's a big question. That's a question I touched on with my guest earlier, because population's aging. Baby boomers are just it's like 10,000 a day are hitting 60, 65. And so you think about that many people every day, statistically speaking, are going to need caregivers more and more. And there's the percentages, obviously, the older you get, the higher the percentage. So it's interesting. I want to point out a couple of things. And I don't know if you've ever thought about this, other than what we've talked about, but laughter can help in so many ways. And when we think of caregivers and patient advocates and patients, but like we're talking now, it reduces stress. No question about it. It enables caregivers and patient advocates to better cope with the difficulties of their roles. I mean, it's so like when I stressed, I carry it partially in my stomach, but I carry it in my stomach. And I think that's very common because I'll tense up. I won't realize it. I'm just going around and I'm probably holding my breath and I'm moving along. And I've talked to so many caregivers, same thing. They all say, not all, a great percentage of them tell me that they end up with gastro issues. They end up with stomach issues.
I know, like from anxiety and personally, yeah, that's definitely a way to, like, so many issues or so much stress is carried in our stomach. And I think one of the worst things for the topic that we're talking about that I've experienced, if there were so many stressors outside, is that something funny is happening or I'm watching something funny and I literally cannot laugh because the stress is that. And I think once you can break through that anxiety, I mean, you can, because there's a self-awareness there too, and you can feel that of like, why am I not reacting to this? Like I'm so anxious or filled with stress depending on the situation. So, I mean, I think there's a wall to break down there, but then also humor, once you can start laughing again, I think that's a big step toward stress reduction. But I can relate on carrying stress. I think I carry it in my back a lot, but I've definitely felt it in my stomach for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting where we all carry stress. So they're different. I've read a bunch of different articles and a study about how laughter and humor helps. And I don't think many people think of it at a granular level like that. You just, it feels good. I feel good. It's laughter. But I mean, you think about, so the stomach, it helps the digestive gastro issues. It increases the elasticity in your blood vessels and it promotes higher levels of oxygen in your blood. So right there, you start thinking it at a different level. Nobody thinks about, hey, I'm going to laugh because it's going to do that.
Mm-hmm.
It happens. Think about when exercise. So when we're exercising, what's one of the main things of exercise is cardio. Well, when you're laughing, think about the breathing you're doing and thinking about the exhalation that you're doing. So it's a cardio function as well. It's beneficial to our lungs. Immune system support. When people are tense, there's so many studies, endless studies out there about how immune systems are suppressed from stress. So again, laughter and comedy can help that, can help alleviate that stress. And so that gets into a whole other topic I'll have to talk with the doctor about on one of these, talking about antibodies and how that really, counters long periods of stress. And then another one would be decreased pain. And so decreased pain, you think about it, it could be both literally and figuratively. And what I mean about that is, the figuratively speaking is you're just so distracted that you're not thinking about the pain. You're laughing and you're having a good time, and that pain is not residing there. It'll come back. It's there. And then literally it can help alleviate that to whatever extent because of all these other benefits. So my point being that humor and comedy are just so important to everybody, but especially caregivers and patient advocates and patients.
I agree with you there. And to the pain point, I think there's nothing worse than, well, there's worse things, but it's a terrible thing to feel like the physical pain of stress. That is, no matter where it is, your stomach, your neck, it's just like, it's a very hard, because you wonder, like, why am I in pain? I didn't do anything. but it's like you can stress yourself out so much in your body. Yeah, but there's more for a doctor, but like producing too much cortisol or whatever it may be, and it's just you're, in colloquial terms, you're just wound up, kind of, and like you're just so tight and tense, and it feels really good when you can get past that. And like you said, you don't know, it may come back, right? But depending on the situation and what you're dealing with, but knowing that you can kind of naturally relieve some of that, it's a big help.
Absolutely. And there's those moments I think of, and I had one of these moments last weekend with a friend of mine. We were on Zoom and we started chatting, and she said something and I reacted, and we just started laughing. And it was one of those situations where we couldn't stop laughing.
Mm-hmm.
And we got to the point where we didn't know what we were laughing at anymore. We were laughing at laughing.
Yes, yeah, that's the best. It just keeps it is infectious. Quick story about the comic that I mentioned, Chris, and we were at a show, as I think it was the last time I went to a show of his, and it was at kind of like a small club bar situation. The bar was in a separate room than the stage, but people were talking at the bar most of the show. And I mean, some of the comics weren't keeping the attention. He was on the stage, and the whole place, like, within a few minutes, he was probably doing about a half an hour, maybe within 5 minutes, the place quieted down and everyone was paying attention to him. And I was like, that's amazing how you do that. He's like, the people that were talking were jealous of the laughter. So like when you hear it, you want to join it. And I think that's something that'll stick with me. I'm like, jealous of the laughter. Like that's an interesting concept. And he was absolutely correct.
I mean, bottom line is laughter can help. It can help caregivers, patient advocates, the patient individually in and of themselves, because it all starts within ourselves, but then it can connect those folks to each other, and which can help both from a physical standpoint, emotional standpoint, psychological standpoint. So I guess it's more than both. It's a number of things, and help overall. So daily laughter is good. It's a good thing. It's healthy. It helps lighten the mood. Helps lighten the mood for anybody, but certainly for the caregiver and the cared for. It helps deal with difficult situations. So here's some things that I have a list of, and it's for people in the audience and people anywhere to think about. So if it's not naturally happening, and sometimes it doesn't naturally happen, that's for sure, here are some things that people can try. If you're a caregiver, patient advocate, you can search for funny stories. That can be a great thing. Google funny stories. That's it. Funny stories about a topic, and see if that helps you first and foremost, but see if that helps you connect with the person you're caring for.
Right.
Watch a funny movie together. I mean, find out what the person that you're caring for, what do they like? Ask them what their top 3 funny movies are. And even if you may not even have heard of it, maybe it was from another generation or 2 previous, it makes them laugh. And so by watching it together, you're going to be connecting. And even if you see them laughing, hopefully it brings you some joy and you laughing as well.
You're right. You're right.
Also ask about old TV shows. There's so many you can find now, whether it's on Netflix or Hulu or whatever it might be. And even if you just have the AMC network, American Movie Classics or whatever, find out what they liked and what they enjoyed watching. And there's another place to laugh and connect. So what was your favorite TV show growing up?
It was probably The Simpsons. I think was probably the longest thread of growing up. So yeah, I could put that on now. And YouTube also is a resource for anyone looking, because you can find at least clips from old TV shows. But what was yours?
Oh my gosh. I can, whenever I knew when I asked this, you were going to ask me, but whenever anybody asks me, what's your favorite? I have one favorite. It's so tough. I loved MASH growing up.
Okay.
I just loved the characters. They were brilliant, smart as could be, was funny as could be. Silly humor, I would probably say reruns of I Love Lucy. She was just a comedic genius.
She was. And if I could give a quick plug, because I wanted to go back to this, not for myself. So my best friend lives in Lucille Ball's hometown, which is Jamestown, New York. And that's where she's from. And they do a whole thing around Lucy, but they built a comedy museum there. And to connect all the dots here, I strongly suggest you go, because I got to see it when they were first starting. And they have George Carlin's like writings. His daughter donated 7 giant trunks of his writings, and they had the display as like part of the preparing to open the museum. So I haven't seen it in action, but cool stuff. And I mean, Lucille Ball set the tone for every sitcom that followed. Like I grew up watching reruns of like 70s TV shows, Taxi and that kind of. Well, Nick at Night like was my thing, but I didn't mean to deviate too far, but I thought you and perhaps your listeners would enjoy knowing that.
Yeah, so 2 things. Taxi was one of my favorites. I just watched some recently with my dad. It was great. The one where Laka had to get married, but everybody has to watch that one. It was a blast. And the other thing was, audience, this was not a plug. I didn't bring up Lucy, so that's
no. I'm glad you did. I'm glad you did.
That was great. Another thing is tell jokes. They can be corny. Find jokes. Go online. If you're a caregiver, find them. Try and connect that way. It's just, again, the humor and the comedy of it. And I think the one thing that we can leave with before a final close is that stand-up comedy. Is there a stand-up comic that the person you're caring for loved and enjoyed? I mean, it could be from the 40s, it could be from the 60s, it could be from the 80s, whenever it is, and then go and find it and watch it together. Because number one, you'll give them joy that you went and got it for them, and then you'll get to watch it with them and you'll be able to connect, and the joy that you will get from watching that person hopefully will also alleviate stress. Bottom line is that it's important for everybody to know it's okay to laugh. Even in the hardest situations, it's okay to laugh. Of course, you don't want to be disrespectful to anybody and so forth, but the message is laugh and try to laugh together, even in the most overwhelming situations.
You're absolutely right. And especially with folks dealing with caring for a loved one. If you can laugh with a friend or a loved one about it's, sometimes laughing, I think, can turn into crying, but sometimes crying can be turned around into laughter too. So it's helpful. Yeah.
That's a really good point. Absolutely. And it's okay to laugh. You may not feel like laughing all the time, but it's okay to laugh. So on that note, Steve, I'm just going to say this was fun.
Thank you. It was fun for me too. I hope I know your other guests are a lot smarter than I am, but I appreciate you inviting me to do this. It's very cool. I love everything you're doing with One Day, One Week. I think it's great. It helps a lot of people. It's a good outlet. So thank you.
No, you're welcome. I appreciate it. And I know we'll be talking soon. So thanks again. And we'll talk soon.
Sounds good. Thanks, Todd.
Right, take care.
You too.
Bye. The primary purpose of the podcast is to educate. While guests are invited to listen, listeners acknowledge that they are not being provided professional advice from the podcast or any guests. One Day, One Week and its sponsor, 17 Commerce LLC, expressly disclaim any and all liability or responsibility for any direct, indirect, incidental, special, consequential, or other damages arising out of any individual's use of, reference to, reliance on, or inability to use the podcast episodes or the information presented in the episodes.